Good morning, everyone in Europe, and good afternoon if there are people in Australia and maybe elsewhere in the world in different time zones. It's a great pleasure to be here for the fourth online CHERN Distinguished Lecture on Global China. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the speaker of today, our distinguished speaker, Professor Sun Wanning. I will say a few words just about me and about today's lecture, and also about the China and Europe Research Network. And then I will introduce Professor Sun more properly, and of course hand over as soon as possible to her for the lecture on digital China, Chinese diaspora, the emergence of a new transnational subject. So my name is Graaff. I'm the chair of the China and Europe Research Network. CHERN, for those who do not know the network yet, is basically a platform for exchange of scholars in academia, but also outside of academia, related to Chinese engagements with and in Europe primarily, but of course we also see this in a broader global context. So people that are working on Chinese engagement with other regions in the world are also very welcome, and the comparison in itself is also very useful, of course. We have several working groups, that's the organization of the network, or working groups in different, say, research areas or empirical domains, from infrastructure to finance and public diplomacy. You can find all that on our website. And it's a very open network. Everyone that is interested in or working on these issues is very welcome to join us. And it's also fairly simple. It's also free of charge. If you go to our website, you will find how to get connected. And you can also sign up for a newsletter if you just want to be informed a bit more before actually joining, or just join in for any of our events, which is from conferences and workshops to webinars and online lectures like these. But we also try to meet in person more often now that this is possible. So you're also welcome to join us there. So that about CHERN. Then a few words about today's lecture and the procedures. So Professor Sun has prepared a lecture of about 40 to 45 minutes. After that, we will have 45 minutes for Q&A. This is a webinar setting, so please, if you have questions, use the Q&A function. It's a different function from the chat, and write down your questions if you have them already during the lecture. You're also welcome to post them after the lecture, and we will then make you a participant. So you're not shown right now as you will be normally in Zoom, but we can make you a participant if we see your question, and you are then in a position to also ask your question if you like to. If you want me to read the question for you, it's also fine. You can just indicate that. So with that said, I now move to the introduction of Professor Sun Wanning. She is a professor in media and communication studies at the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. So it's 7 p.m. in the evening there now, and winter, which is a great contrast to us being here in sunny Amsterdam in the summer. We are really grateful to have her. She's a great expert on the topic of Chinese diaspora and Chinese digital diaspora. She is a member of the College of Experts of the Australian Research Council. She's also a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, and she has been working in this area of cultural anthropology of migration for more than 2 decades. She has actually spearheaded the global diasporic Chinese language media as a distinct area of research, and she has had many publications on this, which you can find on our website. And the recent one is actually published, I think, as we speak, or it's maybe just out. I'm sure that Professor Sun will talk more about that. And the title of that is WeChat and the Chinese Diaspora, which she has published together with Professor Yu. So it goes without saying that we are really extremely pleased to have you joining us, Professor Sun, for this lecture. I very much look forward to it. It's an area I don't know much about myself, so I will learn a lot today, and I'm very happy to give you the floor. And thank you again for joining us to provide this lecture for us.
Okay, shall I start, Nana?
Yes, you're very welcome to start. I'll mute myself.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nana, for that lovely introduction. Yes, good evening. I'm speaking to you today in the west of Sydney in Australia, which is the traditional land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And so I would like to start by paying my respect to the custodians of the land on which I speak to you today, and acknowledging the country and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I would also like to thank the center for inviting me. As I said to Nana, I've never been to Amsterdam, and although I seem to have a growing number of like-minded colleagues there with whom I share research interest in the area of Greater Chinese cultures, as well as rural to urban migration in China. So I hope to be able to visit you one day in person. But in the meantime, I'm just really glad that I can share my research with you on Zoom without having to endure up to 30 hours flight. Yes, so the topic of my talk today is digital Chinese diaspora. So within this context, I would like to also to revisit the concept of Chinese transnationalism. But perhaps just a few words about my approach before I get on to the topic. I guess for tonight's talk, my scope is global, as global Chinese cultures, and I'll be talking mainly from a cultural and anthropological perspective. I guess I would mention an important caveat, that is my own research area of research is media and diaspora. So for those of you who are interested, my collaborator, Professor Hai-Qing Yu at IMIT in Melbourne, and we have just, as Nana just mentioned, have published an edited volume on WeChat and Chinese diaspora. And that includes discussions of how WeChat is used in 12 countries, including Russia, Hungary, Italy, and France. I would ask Nana to put a link to the details of our book in case you are interested. Professor Yu and I are also in the process of publishing our co-authored a monograph book on digital transnationalism in Australia, which we hope to publish this year. That is most likely to be with Brill. There's another Holland connection there. So I guess I'm not a specialist on Chinese diaspora, specifically in Europe. And what little I do know, I mainly learn from scholars, people like Palmieri, Amedi Tuno, Frank Pike, Li Minghuan, and young scholars such as Fanny Beck, who actually has written a chapter for our book. And I myself haven't really done much research in the European context, so my focus won't be on Europe. Although I do hope that whatever I say, you will read my talk as an invitation to you to reflect on the differences and the similarities between Europe and elsewhere. So I guess in that sense, in the kind of implicit sense, my approach is comparative. Also, my global view is, doubtlessly directly shaped by my own personal specific circumstances, which is having lived in Australia for the last more than 30 years. In Australia, Australia has China as the biggest trading partner. But at the same time, Australia sees China as its biggest military threat. Right. And And Australia, in terms of geography, is actually part of the Asia Pacific. But in terms of its history and the political values, it sees itself as part of the global West. So it's in a very, very tricky situation. And it also sees the US as its most important strategic security partner. So therefore, you can see that Australia is kind of wedged between the two superpowers, you know, in the geopolitics that's dominated by the US, China and competition. Of course, the perspective I'm bringing to this talk today is kind of informed by my awareness of Australia's intensely heightened sense of tension and anxiety about China. And I'm curious to learn from you guys whether that sense of tension, anxiety is to the similar extent of, and I suspect not, but I know there is also a certain level in there. Let me start by giving an outline on the research on the cultural politics of Chinese transnationalism in the last 2 decades. Because one of the key concepts that I'm dealing with today is transnationalism. More than 2 decades ago, I think it's 1999 actually, Professor Wanning wrote her book on the global Chinese cultures. And she talked about the fact that her work is driven by a desire to redirect the study of Chinese diaspora. She wanted the focus of the Chinese transnationalism, study of the Chinese transnationalism, to be shifted away from China and onto different other forms of Chineseness. This is because Professor Ong believed that the Chinese diaspora should no longer be defined as solely in relation to the PRC. Of course, Professor Wanning represents a different kind of Chineseness from myself. She lives and writes in the US, and she has a past as a Southeast Asian person with Chinese heritage. Right. Over the past 2 decades, we have seen the publications of volumes of work on the Sinophone culture studies, led by scholars such as the US-based scholar Shu Mei, and who has a Taiwanese heritage. In fact, in 2003, Professor Tu Weiming, who was also had a Taiwanese background, published a chapter in the Sinophone studies. This book is called Sinophone Studies, which is edited by Shu Mei. And Professor Tu's chapter is called Cultural China, the Peripheral as the Center. So there Professor Tu went so far to argue that in the study of the global Chinese culture, the periphery can actually become the center. And he said, and I quote, "It is neither shameful nor regrettable to alienate oneself voluntarily from a political regime that has become culturally insensitive, publicly unaccountable, and oppressive to basic human rights." So that was lasted two decades. However, we have seen a lot of changes and developments in the last 2 decades, especially since the last decade after Xi Jinping came to power. I think these changes are important to review because they're crucial to our understanding of the Chinese transnationalism. So let's spend a few minutes going through these changes. First is, of course, as you can see, is massive migration from the PRC in the last 2 or 3 decades, right? In addition to the growing size of the permanent migration to various parts of the world from the PRC, you also have an increasing number of Chinese in everywhere in the form of international students, business laborers and workers, and investment and tourism, right? So as a result of that, you see a lot of people from China either to settle down permanently or to briefly visit other countries. I think this kind of led to a significant change, if you like, in the demographic composition of the global Chinese diaspora, with Mandarin-speaking migrants from the PRC having, for the first time, surpassed the number of the speakers of the Cantonese and other southern dialect, Chinese dialect. And these dialect-speaking communities used to form the bulk of the earlier migrant cohorts in many countries. So that's the first big change. The second one is China's rise and its soft power push. The last few decades, we have seen China's ascent as a global economic powerhouse and its attendant project of soft power initiatives aiming to reshape the world's view of China. This soft power agenda becomes clear, particularly in the second half of the first half of the first decade, if you like, the second half of the first decade in the millennium. And this was really motivated by a goal, a desire of increasing China's media presence globally, in the hope of improving China's international image, right? Or to use Xi Jinping's own word, to help China to tell its own story, the Chinese story. But having said that, the second decade in the millennium also witnessed a kind of noticeable shift, if you like, in China's thinking about how to convey China's own perspective to the international community. Of course, the notion of the soft power is still pretty much there and still pretty much holds a lot of appeal. This kind of softly touch is no longer the only approach. Recently, we have seen a more confrontational style of communicating to the foreign publics. You know, you all have heard about the warfaring Chinese diplomats twittering away and, sort of becoming quite controversial. So then there is this third factor, which is in response to China's growing assertiveness, China's relationship with the rest of the world has dramatically changed, right? Any countries in the global West, such as North America, Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, they have become quite increasingly anxious about, or even hostile to China. In fact, as I prepared this talk, news just came about EU's Parliament's resolution to take a stand against China over the human rights violations in Xinjiang. Right. An interesting development amidst all this is the growing role of the reduced role of diplomacy, but the growing role of security, intelligence, and the defense institutions in shaping this country's China policy. For instance, I remember that and the head of the MI6 in UK, Richard Moore, said that China is now their biggest priority, which I found that quite amazing. For instance, for another instance, the closure of the Confucius Institute in many places in the US, in Australia, and widespread calls in the closing of the Confucius Institute, and in Sweden and in Germany. I see, media reports about this for some time. This is another telling example of this tendency to decouple with China. And then the fourth change or development is what I call the politicization of the Chinese diaspora. Through this securitization rhetoric and policy in the global West. Now, in these countries, Chinese migrants communities have found themselves somewhat wedged between China and the country of their current residence. And with their political allegiance from time to time called into question by the politicians in the country where they live in. In other words, so the politics of belonging, here I make a distinction between the politics of belonging, which is a kind of state policy and a state action, and the actual sense of belonging, which is individual sense of who they are. So what I'm saying is here that I think that increasingly the politics of belonging at both ends, when I say both ends, I mean China, where people, this is where people come from, and the country of residence, politics has become more coercive, right? Australia politicians more than once have said, you know, you are either with us or you're against us. You know, there's no middle space. So in countries such as the US, Australia and UK, which I watch more closely, it is clear that the loyalty of the Chinese diaspora communities are often called into question. Now, what have all these changes, what kind of impact do all these changes have on the Chinese diaspora themselves? That's something that I think is, I need to talk about before I go on to talk about transnational subjects. Mm-hmm. The Chinese influence and security discourses, which dominate the media and the public commentaries of this country, they mostly present the PRC migrants as problematic figures, right? So because they're either, for instance, portrayed at best innocent, but misguided, duped, or controlled by the Chinese Communist parties, therefore we must protect them. Or they are kind of portrayed as undesirable citizens with their political allegiance lying somewhere else. So in some of these narratives, certain migrant individuals or groups are usually sort of suspected as being either the agents of China's influence agenda, or worse still, as spies and traitors. Of course, they are undeserving of trust and the presumption of innocence. But of course, it would be a mistake to say that this coercive policy of belonging and conditional, what I call conditional integration, that is, you can integrate with us as long as you give up certain allegiances. Of course, this mistake to think that this coercive policy of belonging or the conditional integration is experienced only by the first generation migrants from the PRC. Other Chinese communities who have been here a lot longer, or who are second and third generation migrants, also find themselves needing to respond and react to the new politics of belonging. And they can react in different ways, right? They can react by trying very hard to differentiate themselves from the mainlanders and say, hey, I'm not from mainland, you know, I don't support what China is doing. And some have become even more vocal than before in expressing their hostility towards this CPC and towards the mainlanders, migrants in general. We have seen this tendency very clearly in Australia, and I'm not sure about Europe. And conversely, some migrants from other parts of the world, some Chinese migrants from other parts of the world, or who have been in the West for a long time, have seen this, have become, because of China's rise, actually become more proud of their cultural heritage as Chinese. Also, they may not be subjected to, or they may not be vulnerable to the Chinese government's state politics belonging, but they can't avoid reacting to their Western government's somewhat hawkish policy towards China, and as well as they can't avoid the consequences of this kind of indiscriminate anti-Chinese racism in public places, particularly in last couple of years since the COVID situation, right? a racist person on the street would not actually make a distinction whether you're from mainland China or you're a third generation Chinese person from Malaysia. They wouldn't ask you a question before they throw eggs on your face or something like that, right? So so that certainly has got a lot of people thinking about, who they are, who they want to be, who they want to tell people who they are. So in other words, even though they have nothing to do with PRC, they are having to respond and rethink the question about their cultural identity whenever China presents the world with yet another polarizing issue, right? Whether it is the issue, for instance, in the recent years, is the tension between the PRC and Taiwan, the issue of Taiwan, or the crackdown of political activism in, say, Hong Kong, or the suppression of the Uyghur culture and religion by the central Chinese government in Xinjiang. And they all have inevitably reverberated throughout their respective diaspora politics, because somebody, you have to make a stand somehow, right? So all these have come to bear on diaspora individuals' sense of who they are, and which countries' cultural values they want to identify with, and where their political and civic rights and responsibilities lie now. So as researchers of diaspora and transnationalism, we are confronted with a number of new questions, right? For instance, what happens when the identity politics of the diaspora has been hijacked by either the country of origin, in this case, China, or the country of residence, or both? And what should the migrant do if they get the feeling that they can no longer entertain a double sense of belonging, right? And once upon a time, it's okay to be ambivalent, and it's okay to be reluctant to take sides. But what becomes of them if they feel increasingly this is no longer an option? And to various extent across the globe, I'm not saying every country is different, but to various extent across the globe, I think the transnational space of the political action for the Chinese diaspora seems to have shrunk, or even disappeared in some cases, or even delegitimized. So what happens is, once upon a time, the diaspora see themselves as playing a role as bridging the motherland and their host country. And now, at least as far as some of the people that I know in Australia and the US, they say that the metaphor of the bridge is no longer that realistic. It's very much them being stuck between a rock and a hard place, as we say in English. So the consequences of this is got as two processes. One is a continuous fracturing of the Chinese, transnational Chinese subjectivity. Once upon a time, it was complex. It is now even more complex. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there is this emergence of a range of new Chinese transnational subjectivities. And both of these processes involve China. So for the first generation Mandarin-speaking migrants, then the question for them is quite obvious. How should they position themselves vis-a-vis China? And should the mainland Chinese migrants, because they're the most recent, but the largest cohort, if you like, within the Chinese diaspora, should they feel ashamed or regretful if they cannot fully or voluntarily detach themselves from the political regime of the PRC, as Professor Tu Wei-Min mentioned? Or conversely, should they feel ashamed or regretful if they can voluntarily alienate themselves from their motherland? So the new geopolitical order of today features, it features China's rise, renewed hostility between China and the global West, and the growing population of new Chinese migrants now living in other countries. So knowing answer to these questions, I think is quite important to an understanding of what's becoming of the Chinese transnationalism. So far, I've left out a very important process of development, and I've decided to talk about it separately. And that process is independent of China's rise, but is also integral to our talk. That is the process of digitalization, right? All over the world, so societies are experiencing digitalization, right? The arrival of the social media platforms in the last decade has been a game changer. It changed our lives. And this has implications for our study of Chinese diaspora. We all know that Twitter came into existence around 2011, and Facebook came about more or less at the same time. And the Chinese social media platform WeChat was launched in January 2011 by China's super tech company Tencent. And it's the same company that developed and owned QQ, which is a Chinese WeChat platform that predated WeChat. So whether it's WeChat, is Weixin is in China, and WeChat is outside China. And the kind of twin sisters have kind of fundamentally changed the way that in which Mandarin-speaking migrants conduct their transnational lives. They use WeChat to send personal messages. They use WeChat to engage in groups and community organization communication. And they use WeChat to access and share information or to start or run a company or a business. None of this existed. None of these platforms and digital practice existed when Professor Anwar Ong talked about Chinese transnationalism or flexible citizenship, right? In the early part of 2010, WeChat subscription account really transformed. I don't know how many of you in the audience use WeChat and how many of you subscribe to a WeChat subscription account. But the WeChat subscription account really transformed the way in which digital Chinese language media was delivered and distributed among the diaspora. Well, since 2016, in addition to WeChat, the digital content is also being delivered by the apps that are custom made by the media companies themselves. So what I'm trying to say is that, for instance, in Australia, the biggest digital media, news and current media content in Chinese language is called Australia Today. And it's got Sydney Today and Melbourne Today. It's a huge following, and most people would actually access content through them. So Sydney Today not only used WeChat to push its content out, it also developed its own app, and that also delivers its own content. But the app is also, integrated to WeChat. So as a result of that, WeChat is absolutely crucial to the pushing of the content. So we're talking about social media platform on one hand, and the content of digital Chinese language media on the website on another, right? Before social media came into existence, we only had Chinese language website, right? And you can go on the internet and look at some of the Chinese language content. So that's why in the 90s and early 20s, beginning of millennium, we're talking about Chinese cyberspace. In those days, it was only China, the Chinese internet. But now we actually, because of the arrival of the social media, this completely changed the way that the digital content was produced, distributed, and delivered. And also across the world, digital technologies are beginning to break down the boundaries between Chinese language ethnic media, the mainstream Chinese media, and the Chinese state media, right? Because once upon a time, you've got these three disparate, separate areas, right? Chinese media, state media is out there in China, and ethnic Chinese media is published either in Holland or in Italy or in Australia. And then you've got the mainstream language media that is, in Italian or in English. But because of the social media and because of the porous kind of connection between the Western social media, such as Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and the Chinese social media such as WeChat, then you have the situation where the content of this previously separate media start to flow into each other's space, then influencing, contesting, and conflicting with each other in terms of ideologies and ideas and views. The increasing use of the mobile device is also collapsing the differences, distinction between, like in once upon a time in our media studies, we have the producer, the content, and the user. And now that the producer, the distinction between the producer and the user is very blurred. A lot of content produced by the user end up being, becoming part of the news. So, that's another sort of fundamental difference. In Australia, as I said, Sydney Today is the biggest website delivered through the WeChat. In UK, it's Hongling Jing, 英国红领巾, the Red Scarf, with his subscription account, hugely influential in telling people, Chinese-speaking people in UK, where to travel, which restaurants to eat, and what kind of services to information to look for. I'm also quite intrigued by a very hugely influential website called 新欧洲 New Europe, 新欧洲.com. Apparently, it originally started in France as it's called something like 战斗在法国, or I don't know how they translated into English or French. And now it's proved to be extremely wide-ranging, sort of in terms of the content it carries, including news and the current affairs that is specific to the country of origin. So in other words, 新欧洲 looks like it's just one side, but it actually has 600,000 subscribers from different parts of Europe, right? And mostly catering to the international students and the young migrants, first-generation migrants in Europe, in European countries such as France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and Hungary. I was going through how the 新欧洲 classify the content, a different type of content, and I was very interested to see that they have Italy, France, Germany, so on and so forth. But in addition to that, they have 国内, which is translated into back home or domestic, whereas in this case, 国内 means China, which is very, very interesting. It's like domestic, whereas they're already out there, in the world, but they still see China as my country. So it's called 国内, China. So in 国内, this news about China. And then there's a separate category, which is 温州, which is very interesting. Why out of everywhere in China, there's 温州 singular, simply because it's the singularly the place that produces a lot of early and still currently is sort of migrants to Europe and to France and Italy and Spain. So I just find it quite interesting how that's kind of it functions as a transnational space, and it also has yet another separate category called 华人, that is Chinese diaspora. So in this category, anything that's happened to the Chinese communities in Panama, in Africa, in Australia, become a matter of interest because they want to know how other Chinese communities in other countries are doing. So for instance, if there is a racist attack against a Chinese person somewhere in Flushing, in New York City, China downtown, and the people in Europe will know about it and they find it of interest, right? And in my research with some of the Chinese language providers, digital Chinese language providers in Australia, and I asked some editors, and I said, surely when you decide what sort of news you want to carry, you don't use the same structure of news value as the Australian mainstream news. So how do you, what is the hierarchy of importance according to which you decide what's relevant? And they're very clear, the answer is very clear. First of all, anything that's happened with the Chinese community in Sydney, that's the most important thing. Secondly, anything that happened to the Chinese community within Australia, that's the second. Third, anything that happens that's in China that has certain policy relevance about the Chinese migrants, that's the third. And the fourth one, anything about the Chinese diaspora elsewhere. So, you know, and only then they want to find out news and current affairs that are, you know, sort of leading stories in the mainstream sort of English language media, right? So that's an entirely different sort of structure of news value there. Now, Alexandra, if I could ask you to put on a slide number 3 for me now, because I want to talk about the connection, yes, between digital practice and the diaspora individuals' transnational subjectivity. Because you might think, so far, what you've been talking about, a whole range of things about what's the connection between digital and the transnational. Perhaps I would like just to start by remind you of something that you might remember reading in the paper or not. That's something that happened in the US a year and a half ago. I think so in August 2020, President Trump signed an executive order banning TikTok and WeChat, right? Citing security reasons, saying it's a matter of national security. The president ban was followed by, you know, when people all over the world heard this, they became very anxious, even including in Australia, because they thought, well, if US is banning that, it's only logical that it's only a matter of time before, you know, we are affected in our country. So they were watching it with close interest and anxiety. But following the announcement, there are 5 US lawyers of Chinese heritage. They founded an organization. And this organization, they call themselves the US WeChat Users Organization. And the organization published an open letter calling for WeChat users to donate money to them so that they can support a legal campaign against Trump's proposed ban. So a few weeks later, I think they launched this legal suit in the San Francisco federal court against President Trump's legal ban. And the lawsuit claimed that Trump's ban was unconstitutional because it violated the First Amendment right to receive foreign speech. This was a very well-organized, large-scale and a grassroots civic action on the part of the Chinese American community. Not surprisingly, WeChat was the main platform for the grassroots mobilization and organization for this initiative. It's interesting, like in order to protect our use of WeChat, we are using WeChat now to mobilize action. And so I actually got a request from one of the 5 lawyers saying, would you be prepared to speak as an anthropologist to give witness testimony to the importance of use of WeChat for diaspora in their everyday life? And I did. So it was also, WeChat was used as the main channel through which these lawyers explained the legal process, provided updates, and foreshadowed further actions. And that was this NGO raised $1 million from donations from WeChat users based in US. And they were very, very clear and very careful not to take 1 single cent from WeChat, Tencent itself, and they declare they have nothing to do with WeChat or its Chinese government. They were only protecting their own rights as the consumers in the US, and they do not necessarily want to see this as a support for the Chinese government. Why am I telling you this story? Because I think the story helped me make a few points about digital transnationalism. The first point is that the potential of WeChat, we see the potential of WeChat in promoting social activism is quite significant. This is quite important for our understanding of a diaspora politics and a diasporic public sphere. Despite the fact that the WeChat is a platform that has its authoritarian home and origin, right? So in a way, WeChat is part of the Chinese government's control machinery. Yet at the same time, it's an indispensable platform for many people in diaspora. So this is the paradox we're looking at, right? But to see WeChat not only through the lens of propaganda, Chinese control, is simplistic. WeChat can also be seen as a metaphor, since it symbolizes both the Chinese state control and the productive possibility of transnational subject production. Right. So that is the first reason I think that story might be useful. The second one is that I think the story helped me make an argument about the relationship between digital practices and transnational subjectivity. That it is not that actually individuals in transnational space adopt certain diasporic subject positions before or after they started using digital platforms or become habituated to this media. It is that when they begin the process of becoming a particular kind of transnational subject, only when they are taking action informationally or digitally and in this space. So it's not their subject, WeChat is not epiphenomenal to what they're doing. It is increasingly integrated and constitutive of that process itself. Slide 4, please, Alexandra. Yes, and also I think that the Trump and WeChat story helped me to make sort of a point about the relationship between identity and rights. This is a quote from a Turkish scholar, French scholar of Turkish origin, and she says, which I think is quite eloquently, that transnationalism leads in any case to an institutional expression of multiple belonging, where the country of origin becomes the source of identity, and this country of residence a source of rights. And the emergent transnational space has become a space of political action, combining the two or more countries. So in this sense, I think the story seems to be a perfect illustration of the political space between the homeland and the host country. Slide 5, please, Alexandra. So, so what does digital transnationalism mean in methodological terms for people who study or who explore this area? Well, personally, I believe that to get a clear sense of what goes into the making of the transnational subject means asking a number of questions about the digital practices. First of all, we need to sort of figure out the extent to which preferences for social media platforms among the population of people with Chinese heritage, and how they shape the transnational politics. For instance, WeChat is predominantly preferred by mainland Chinese, and a few non-mainland Chinese who wish to communicate with mainland Chinese. So it's predominantly associated with mainland Chinese. But Chinese migrants from Taiwan may prefer Line, which is a totally different social media platform. And the migrants or the people, people with Chinese heritage with Hong Kong or other Southeast country may prefer to use WhatsApp, right? And don't know how to use WeChat, right? So in a way, the actual preferences, the choices of the platform itself is not, it does not actually tell you directly, but it kind of indexes the kind of cultural belonging, a sense of who do you think you want to signal to the world you are. So that's one thing you could look at. The other thing you can ask is this user, is this person in the transnational space using only one particular media platform, or is this person straddling a whole range of platforms? For instance, in my ethnographic studies of the WeChat users in Australia, I find that a lot of people, some people's English is not very good, so they access mostly through Chinese language content. And even about the news that's happening in Australia, they actually access through Chinese language content, translated into Chinese. So they are the single mono platform users. And so they have no way of knowing what's going on in the mainstream media unless it's translated into Chinese. Whereas there are some other people, they have more, they're bilingual, and they have have WeChat account as well as Twitter account, and they're sort of seamlessly and effortlessly move between these platforms. And then their perspectives and their points of views are a lot more complex, and they are exposed to a lot of whole range of other positions, right? So that's another sort of angle from which we can go in to look at their sense of identity. And also the identity status of the social media users. By that I mean identity, I mean, are they naturalized citizens in their country of residence? How long have they lived there? Are they first generation migrants? Or are they the children of the third generation migrants? Or are they Chinese international student or student visa? Or do they come here as a tourist visa? Or do they come here as skilled migrants or as business investors? And so we call them sojourners. So each categories, they would have a different sense of expectations from the host country, and different kind of sense of where their own rights and liability responsibilities lie, right? So that's another thing to watch out for. And of course, we can ask the question of to what extent a person's language skills and whether this person is can only speak Chinese, or this person is capable of speaking both Cantonese and Mandarin, as well as English or French or Italian, right? So, so what is the socioeconomic status of the user? For instance, I know that in France, in certain part of Europe, such as Italy and Spain, but particularly in France, you have early migrants who came to Wenzhou to do small businesses, and kind of the bulk of the working class sort of migrants. Then they have a different kind of cultural sensibilities. And now that you've got the Xin Yimin, of the people who come on the golden visas, the people like as Fanny Beck's chapter about Hungary tells us, and also to some extent in France too, that the educated bilingual middle class professionals, and they have a different sort of expectations from what France or what Hungary can offer them, and what their sense of obligations are, and so they and how they use social media to express and to articulate that self sort of positioning, if you like. So that's the identity. And then we can look at the relationship between social media and ethnic media. That is, as I said before, in some countries where the Chinese population is not that big, such as, for instance, South Africa. I visited South Africa and look at some of the situations with in Johannesburg and Durban, and look at how how many Chinese language papers there were, and do they have Chinese radio station, and to what extent that they are actually delivered, the content delivered by the social media platform. And then you compare that with, say, the US or Australia, where there is a sizable, quite a large Chinese population. So, you know, the bigger the population is, the more integrated the Chinese language social media is with the Chinese digital media and with the legacy traditional Chinese language media. When I say legacy, I mean newspaper, you know, radio, and this kind of thing. So that's another entry point from which we can ask questions about transnational formation. We can ask about the extent to which people use social media to access what kind of content. Do they only use this to access People's Daily, Xinhua, and Global Times, CCTV, CGTN, or do they, because they miss home, the back at home, or do they actually use this to access what's happening about the Chinese diaspora elsewhere, so that they might think of moving to a third country? Or do they actually access content using the platform in order to find out what the non-Chinese population in their adopted country are talking about, learning about the new culture and habits? So this whole range of questions we can ask. And finally, probably very importantly, we can ask about the extent to which their social media use is subject to censorship, right? We all know the WeChat is subject to state regulation, even though its headquarters is based in Singapore. It's the international arm in Singapore, is still subject to content regulation. And to a lot of people in diaspora who are now using WeChat, some of them are still using Weixin because they carry the Weixin with them when they migrate. So they still have a Chinese account registered in China, which is even more subject to censorship. So we cannot ask as to, okay, you are using a WeChat account, a social media platform is controlled or even regulated by the Chinese government, but now you're operating in different national contexts. How are you negotiating this tension? So, you know, are you okay with censorship, or are you trying to circumvent the censorship by doing some tricky sort of anti-censorship tricks? Or, you know, so are you sharing with other users about how to use VPN in order to sort of access for the forbidden content? Or, you know, all sorts of things, you know, a whole range of strategies and attitude and positions to do with the Chinese censorship. So that also itself says a lot about one's relationship to the Chinese government. So that's, Alexandra, could I ask you to put the last one, slide 6 on, please? I guess one of the most often asked questions about Chinese language social media, particularly WeChat, is, does WeChat encourage Mandarin-speaking migrants to continue to live in the Chinese world, so that its way is kind of a hindrance or obstacle to them becoming integrated to the host country, and it discourages or even prohibit them from becoming citizens in a new country? Our own research findings on this are actually quite inconclusive, because on one hand, we have not produced data that either conditionally validate or completely discredit the view, right? Because we found that social media in Chinese diaspora it functions in a wide range of ways that are not always mutually reinforcing, right? For instance, they may have enabled the first generation Chinese migrants to stay more connected, more than ever, with families and friends back in the mainland China. But they also seems to present some potential means for rewording, no longer living in the Chinese world, but rewording by helping migrants to overcome the challenges that they often encounter in their civic and political participation in a new country. In Australia, we have just finished a political election, and we have just voted a new government in. And I witnessed firsthand how much the Chinese diaspora wanted the conservative government to go, and how hard they work to mobilize activities on WeChat in order to achieve this outcome. It is simply quite stunning, the way it is. And also in the book that we have published on WeChat, we have a France-based researcher, Wang Simeng, and she studied the Chinese in France. And she gave a really nice example of how the people in France use WeChat during the COVID time to mobilize civic actions against the Chinese and anti-Chinese or anti-Asian racism, especially during the pandemic. And she also looked at how WeChat is used by the various Chinese subgroups on political issues during the election. Wang Simeng found that the use of WeChat reflect the different views, political views, and positioning among the different users, and also related to their various social status and different class background. At the same time, another chapter written by Gianluigi Luigi and Necro and Lala Hu, and their research in Italy suggests that the local Italian institutions increased use of WeChat, such as Italian tourism, Italian government, Italian investment board using WeChat to sort of promote sort of trades and economic relations between Italy and China. And also during the COVID, and using WeChat to share and publicize health related information and to WeChat users. So I guess in this reason, you know, their example provides context in which to explore how the social media were used as a form of crisis management, right? Because you know, health crisis such as COVID, communicating with the community as well as the government, and so in that way facilitating that kind of public health communication and community building during the COVID-19 period. Finally, as I just say briefly two points to summarize and to finish the talk in conceptual terms about this. First of all, I think in recent years, despite the agenda, let's go back to the transnationalism, the decenter China argument, and I think in recent years, despite the agenda to decenter China, especially within the Sinophone studies, I believe a new reality is forcing on us to reintroduce China and the people from China into the research paradigm for a number of reasons, right? So it's somehow China seems to insist on inserting itself into the sphere of the Chinese transnationalism, whether the rest of the world likes it or not, right? So we've got to deal with this. And so we need to rethink the politics of the Chinese transnationalism by putting China back into the equation. I guess that is the central argument that I'm putting on the table here today. But but this does not necessarily mean I want to privilege the Middle Kingdom, right? I don't want to say, you know, China is the only game in town, right? Nor do I want to say that we should actually put China in by accepting its politics and the political agenda unconditionally, right? What do I mean then by putting China back into the equation in our study of transnationalism? I guess I mean three things. First of all, I think we should look at what the Chinese state politics of belonging is doing to the diaspora's sense of who they are. So there's the impact of Chinese policy on the diaspora. That's the first one. Secondly, we want to look at how the Chinese state politics belonging Oh, no, sorry, not the China one. The second one is how the state policies belonging in the host country react to China's state policies belonging, right? Because currently it's China's influence, Chinese threat, anxiety, and threat and anxiety and fear. So, and finally, we need to look at how the diaspora re-articulate their own sense of Chinese-ness in response to these political forces at both ends, right? So that is the nutshell, in a nutshell, the central argument of my talk. And hopefully you can see that my discussion of Chinese language, digital, and social media, WeChat in particular, it embodies the kind of rethinking that of Chinese transnationalism that I'm putting forward here. I think I'll stop there, Nana, and be happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really excellent. Thank you for not only talking about your latest research topic. There's the book. Can we see it?
The book is blurred.
Yes, yes. So
we get a Chinese diaspora. So it's coming out of it came out last month, and yeah. I'll put a link to you.
Great. Yes. I think I put the link in the chat already.
Right.
And but many thanks for placing this research and this topic of Chinese digital diaspora, or the digital aspect of Chinese diaspora, in this much larger context also of growing geopolitical rivalry and reactions at also the state level, and what the impact of that is on Chinese diaspora. So I think it was a really great big expose of that very complex and multi-layered problem. We are going to end the recording.